From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages and my colleagues Joe Sternberg and Jillian Melcher. The topic for today is the Ukraine war. And in the wake of the attacks that Putin has unleashed on Ukrainian cities, Joe, at least the initial public response seems to be additional support from both Europe and the United States. Emmanuel Macron, president of France, was lacerating in his criticism of Putin for the attack. The G7 had a meeting this morning. We don't know what happened. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was supposed to address those leaders. They were there to discuss, I think, how to respond to Putin, not just after these attacks, but no doubt also what to do if there happens to be some kind of escalation, including an up to chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons. How do you read, Joe, from your European vantage point, the solidarity of the EU and Britain in support of Ukraine?
Well, I think that it is holding surprisingly strong. I mean, certainly much stronger than some of us would have expected or feared when the war began back in February. And I should point out that in addition to some of the rhetorical gestures that you mentioned and some of the meetings that are going on, we're also seeing in the past day or two substantive military support. I mean, Germany has finally announced that they're going to send some of the Iris-T surface-to-air defenses that they had promised many months ago and inexplicably had failed to deliver up to now. I mean, they now say that those air defense systems will be in Ukraine within days. So this is unlocking substantive aid in the form of military hardware that Ukraine needs to defend itself. And I think that it's because Russia keeps doing things that remind Western Europeans of what the stakes are here. I mean, whether it was the revelations of the war crimes in Bucha that we saw in April, whether it was more revelations of Russian war crimes in other areas that the Russians have evacuated after this counteroffensive over the past month, whether it's now the military strikes on civilian targets of the past couple days. My sense is that for European public opinion and then the European politicians who feed off of that opinion, this is all reminding people in Europe of what is at stake in this conflict and what kind of an adversary Russia is. And I think that that is having a big impact on this issue of the solidarity, despite the difficult winter and the energy crisis and all of the rest of it.
Just as we were taping this, Joe and Jillian, the statement has come across from the G7 on Ukraine this morning. It's a very strong statement. I'm scrolling down through it now on my iPhone, and it is a very strong statement condemning Russians' actions, the deliberate, as it calls. We deplore deliberate Russian escalatory steps, including the partial mobilization of reservists and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, reaffirm that any use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons by Russia would be met with severe consequences, unquote. No definition of what severe consequences would mean, but it's a very strong statement, and it reaffirms full support, as it says, to Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty in its internationally recognized borders, which, of course, includes Crimea and the Donbass, and reassures President Zelensky of continued support even after any kind of settlement in the war, which is a suggestion that there will be ongoing ties with the West to Ukraine, and that would mean some, perhaps, it doesn't say this, but perhaps security ties as well as, of course, EU entry. Jillian, let's talk about the specific military requests. The Ukrainians have wanted tanks, and they wanted more advanced missile systems. They haven't gotten the tanks, the advanced tanks. They have gotten the HIMARS missile systems from the U.S., which they've used to great effect. But they've also been asking all along for advanced missile defenses, that's surface-to-air missile defenses. And they're really underscoring that in the wake of the missile attacks of the last 2 days.
Yeah, you're right on that. And I think that they're seeing this moment. It is difficult to watch in the West civilians being targeted in this really brutal way. I mean, yesterday, you look at the missile attacks in Kiev, a playground was hit. So I think they're seizing on this moment to make a really important point, which is just as the resistance to Putin is a whole of society attempt, Putin is targeting civilian targets, and it's something that he's been doing throughout the war. So they have a very legitimate need for this air defense system. You know, when we're talking about the missile systems, there was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal this weekend about how effectively they're using HIMARS, What they want now, though, is the ATACMS system, which would allow them to have a greater range for those HIMARS to strike deeper within Russian-occupied territory. And that's something that the West has not yet provided. I really hope that we do, because they've accomplished so much with the HIMARS that they have right now. I believe that's about a 50-mile range. This would get it up to about, I believe, over 150, so it's pretty significant.
What's the reluctance been to provide those? I guess it's concern that the Ukrainians might use them to target Russian military installations inside Russia?
That's one of the arguments that's been put forward. I don't find it a very persuasive one, because with their HIMARS and with some of the territory that they've reclaimed, they can already strike in Russian territory. So that bridge has kind of been crossed. I think the fear of the Biden administration has been that if you provide them with some of this weaponry, that it would be perceived as escalatory. But on the flip side, I mean, what we saw yesterday was a clear escalation from Russia. What we've seen with Putin's nuclear rhetoric is an escalation. So I don't think that's perhaps a valid concern either.
What about the tanks? Obviously, that would be used to go after dug-in Ukrainian positions in the eastern part of the country and around the city of Kherson.
Yeah, that's in the south, and that's going to be difficult to fight because the Russians are more dug in, more fortified than they were around Kharkiv. And the thing about warfare like this, it's really reminiscent of World War II, and it's something that we haven't seen in a long time. But when you are fighting this kind of trenched warfare, just grinding equipment on equipment warfare, a lot of it gets worn out. So even though the Ukrainians started this war with equipment like tanks, even though they've been able to recover some of the Russian equipment as they made gains in Kharkiv, a lot of this stuff just gets ground up on the battlefield. So they do need this as a replacement.
And the request for these national advanced surface-to-air missile system defense systems, Joe, would be something we have said we're going to deliver some to the Ukrainians, but it's not going to be there for weeks on end. And that's a good illustration of the delay that the United States has too often exhibited in getting Ukraine some of its weapons needs. There's also, they're calling for Patriot missile defense systems, but the U.S. has been reluctant to provide those. And the main reason there, I guess, is we have a limited number of them. And as our colleague Kate Batchelder has said, the Army Patriot teams are some of the most in demand in the U.S. military. And I guess they're worried. And they take a fair amount of technical training to operate. And I think there's some concern that U.S. operators would have to go inside Ukraine, and they don't want to do that.
Yes, and I think that that is a very good reason for us also to keep our focus on mobilizing resources from European partners. And there has actually been some positive development there. I mean, not only has the shock over these Russian attacks of the past couple of days, not only does that seem to be unlocking some of this military aid that had been in limbo for a long time, but I'm also starting to detect some progress on this broader nuclear blackmail that Putin had been deploying so effectively to try to deter some of this aid. Because, as Jillian pointed out, I think that this fear that providing the aid would be perceived in the Kremlin as an escalation or a provocation is something that has certainly been holding a lot of European allies back in terms of the aid that they're shipping. But, you're starting to see things like, Britain's top spy today delivering a speech and doing some media appearances where he's reassuring people that they actually aren't seeing any evidence at the moment that Putin is planning to deploy a nuclear weapon of any sort. So maybe this is the time to be sending some of this military aid. Perhaps there is an element of blackmail going on with the nuclear threats. And I think that the longer you have time to develop that kind of message within Western Europe, the more comfortable people can feel sending some of this aid that Ukraine needs, and perhaps a bit less the pressure that places on American resources.
Yeah, the U.S. has provided the vast majority of the military aid to Ukrainians, and some of the smaller Eastern European countries have done very well, too. I'm awaiting the latest accumulation of the tally from different countries by the Kiel Institute, which has tracked these things out of Europe. But France and some of the others have not done as much as they could in terms of their overall GDP for Ukraine, and we can hope they would do more. Also, let's hope that President Biden actually uses his bully pulpit more to explain the American mission in Ukraine, what the stakes are. He's been very bad at that, even though I think the overall policy has been quite effective. He's been bad at explaining it, and I think he should be concerned about eroding support in some parts of the country, especially maybe among Republicans, voters on the right about the mission in Ukraine and why it deserves support. All right. Thank you all for listening. You can email us, our valuable listeners, at pwpodcasting@wsj.com. And if you like the show, please do hit that subscribe button. Wall Street Journal subscribers can also join Kim Strasso, Karl Rove, and yours truly for a live opinion event. Can Republicans retake Congress? On Monday, October 17th at 7 p.m. That will be live in Dallas or streamed online. And for more information, go to wsjplus.com/opinion live for tickets and more information. And as always, we will be back here tomorrow for another edition of Potomac Watch.